Hello everybody and welcome to this taster session for modern and medieval languages at the University of Cambridge. I am recording this from home, but on the photograph on your screen you can see me in my office where you would spend many hours, hopefully interesting ones, should you decide to embark on this course. So in this video I would like to explain to you a little bit about the course, what it contains, and obviously it's a very rich and diverse course. So you would study language, of course, so that's vocabulary, syntax, grammar, and so on and so forth. You will also practice translation from your original language into the language that you're studying, and also from the language you're studying back to the original language. You will have conversation classes to perfect your expression skills. You will have a chance, should you so desire, to dabble into linguistics, which is a more scientific approach to language. And you would study many more things, such as, for instance, literature and film. And that in itself is extremely broad because you will study text that dates all the way back to the Middle Ages and all the way up to films from the 21st century. Of course, you will study the history within which these works are embedded, and as you study the history, you will study the society of the country whose language you chose to study. So you will be, introduced to current affairs, say the ideological background to the Ukraine war if you're studying Ukrainian or Russian, or perhaps the alarming rise of the far right in France if you're studying French. And as you can see, history and society necessarily lead us into politics. Now, at the end of this video, I will tell you a few things about how the course is structured, but really what I would like to do right now is to give you an example of the kind of thing you will be taught, and to show you also how the different parts of the courses all shed light one on the other. So what you learn in languages, of course, is necessary for you to tease out meaning from historical works, but we will see how history sheds light on literature, and also conversely how literature, and in our case poetry, can enable us to understand better the relevance of history. So as a test object, if you like, I chose one of the most famous songs in the world, and that's the French national hymn, La Marseillaise. So probably you will know it. Nonetheless, to refresh your memory, I would attempt to sing the chorus, because in this chorus is the verse on which we will focus. So the chorus goes, Marchons, marchons, qu'un sang impur abreuve nos sillons. I hope that was not too unpleasant. Okay, so the first word was marchons, let us march, and then the sentence, translated on your screen, that followed was qu'un sang impur abreuve nos sillons. May an impure blood water our furrows. Now, I'm sure you all agree at first sight that this is a pretty violent and shocking sentence, and indeed it is often read as such. So much so that it is a cause of frequent polemics in France. For instance, the daily Le Parisien reported a few years back that there was a great debate agitating French society, with people demanding that the lyrics to La Marseillaise be changed. For indeed, today, this notion of impure blood smacks of racism, not a matter to be taken lightly in a country which has a heavy colonial past, and besides, this notion of bathing the fields with the enemy's blood seems really like an incitement to mass massacre. So if really that was the meaning of the lyrics, then there would be a good case for them being changed. However, as I will try to show you now, there is also a completely different way of understanding this sentence. But if we are to work our way towards this other interpretation, we must refresh our memory cursorily as to the events of the French Revolution itself. Now, as you probably know, many date the starting point of the French Revolution, or at least its kicking into high gear, from the 14th of July 1789, when the people of Paris stormed the Bastille. The Bastille was a prison, very menacing and very symbolic of the monarchic order. And the people of Paris, when they took the Bastille, they were out to topple that monarchic order. Now this order, which saw the monarchy and the nobility enjoying privileges over the commoners, was quite literally based on blood. So in the official story, the nobility were the descendants of the Franks. The Franks were a northern European people who had invaded Gaul in the Middle Ages, and conquered it. And the Gauls were supposed to be the ancestors of the commoners. And the initial victory of the Franks over the commoners was supposed to justify the everlasting dominance of the nobility over them. And now, obviously, when the people of France took the Bastille and endeavored to topple the hierarchical structure of what they called the ancient regime, the nobility was not very happy. And many of them actually took flight. And they crossed the border into the neighboring countries. But they didn't do this merely to save their lives, but to mount a counterattack. All these countries were monarchies as well, and the French nobility endeavored to gather support from them in order to invade France and crush the revolution. And this is in the context in which the Revolutionary War started, and therefore in the beginning of these wars, when La Marseillaise was written, the French revolutionaries marched to meet foreign enemies, and they were sure that these enemies were headed by the émigrés. The émigré being the name that was given to the emigrated nobleman. Now, in this context, we may wonder, what sense does it really make to call the émigré impure blood, when actually their everlasting claim to glory was that their blood was pure? It does seem a little bit strange, and it's tempting to think that the words impure blood did not actually refer to the noble themselves. Perhaps the revolutionaries were performing a powerful rhetorical move called the inversion of the inversion of the stigmata. Now, the inversion of the stigmata happens when a discriminated or racialized population reclaims derogatory terms used to demean it and you wear these words as badges of honor. Perhaps the most famous example of such inversion of the stigmata in French culture was performed by Aimé Césaire. Aimé Césaire was born in Martinique, a French colony, and he became the champion of a movement he called négritude, thus reclaiming the insult that was used to label black men. And in the quotation on the image on your screen, Aimé Césaire writes that négritude is the simple recognition of the fact of being black and the acceptation of this fact, of our destiny as black people, of our history and of our culture. Now, when Aimé Césaire decides to proudly proclaim his négritude, what he's doing is that he's reclaiming something, a term that is associated with defeat, humiliation, and transform it into a term that means or signifies resilience, resistance, knowledge, and wisdom born out of suffering and an indomitable will to live freely. So this move, the inversion of the stigmata, it goes way back in time, and we know that it was already performed during the French Revolution. The most famous example of this inversion in the French Revolution is probably the name that the revolutionaries used for themselves, as they called themselves sans-culottes. Sans-culottes means without breeches. Now, at the time, the upper classes wore breeches over their trousers, and they looked down upon the working classes, which had no such vestimental niceties, and they called them the sans-culottes. And when the revolutionaries decided to say, yes, we are the sans-culottes, and proudly call themselves so, of course, they're operating a displacement, as the shame normally attached to manual labor was actually transformed into pride, and the pride of living off one's estate was transformed into the disgrace of being a parasite, living off other people's toil. So, if the revolutionaries were capable of performing inversion of the stigmata when they referred to themselves as sans-culottes, then it is tempting to think that when they sing of the impure blood, the blood of which they are thinking is their own blood. And now we would have a completely different meaning to the song, as it will be a song where revolutionaries would say, let us march to war and shed our own blood to water our furrows. Now, this interpretation is all the more tempting if we take notice of something that is lost in translation when we translate the Marseillaise. So you remember the French verse says, qu'un sang impur abreuve nos sillons. The verb abreuver, I translated by the word to water. The problem is that in English, to water can be used both with reference to a plant or to an animal. You water a flower and you water a cow. In French, however, we have two different words. If it is a plant, we say that we will arroser the plant. And if it is an animal, we say that we will abreuver the animal. And now you see that the word abreuver in the French only refers to the animal, which means that in the verse from La Marseillaise, may an impure blood bathe water our furrows, there is actually a personification that is lost in translation. The fields are compared to animals, that is to living things, things with needs, with thirst, with emotion, and which are capable of pleasure and pain. This smacks of a very intense relationship to the earth. And this is perhaps not surprising if you think that the main protagonists of the French Revolution were peasants. And indeed, 85% of the French population were peasants at the time of the French Revolution. And what is more, this idea that the blood of the revolutionaries have to nourish the earth is all the more relevant if you think that the most symbolic act of the French Revolution was the planting of liberty trees, of freedom trees, which is what you can see on the image on your screen. Every time there was a turning point in the revolution, or perhaps a great victory, the revolutionaries would plant trees, and the growth of the trees would symbolize the growth of freedom. So with all this in mind, our song now comes across very differently. Rather than being a kind of a sadistic impulse to massacre enemies that are seen racially inferior, the song now describes the heroic self-sacrifice of people marching to defend freedom, willing to bathe their own field with their own blood so as to nurture the trees of liberty. And I believe, and I hope you will agree, that this meaning is somewhat more appealing. Now, this interpretation of the song is not my own. And many other historians besides me actually believe in it. But they are not alone, and those who do not believe in this interpretation do not do so without reason. A colleague once asked me, how can you seriously believe that the revolutionaries, when they sang of the impure blood, did not mean the enemy's blood, when you read what Barnave said in 1789? Now, I forgot to mention that the reading of the song that I just suggested seems to be very fitting with the slogan of the revolutionaries, which was La liberté ou la mort, liberty or death. And obviously in this slogan, it's pretty clear that the death, which is the only alternative to living free, is their own death. Now we return to Barnave. Barnave was a revolutionary that was mainly active in the early days of the revolution. And in these early days, right around the 14th of July, there had been some violent incidents in the streets of Paris. Some lynching, actually. Some wealthy merchants had been lynched by the angry populace. And of course, this had caused many outrages and some consternation. And Barnave tried to dismiss the outrage at the lynching by declaring at the pulpit of the National Assembly, they want to soften us, gentlemen, in favor of the blood that was spilt yesterday. Was that blood so pure? Now, obviously, when Barnave speaks of the blood that is not so pure, he doesn't mean that of the revolutionaries, but that of the enemies of the revolution. Therefore, it is true, it was possible to characterize the enemies of the revolution as having impure blood. And this, of course, is solid ground for which to interpret the Marseillaise as referring to the enemies when it describes or when it qualifies blood as impure. Perhaps, but even if this is the case, still this would not lead us to our starting point. Because in our starting point, we considered or we assumed that when the revolutionaries spoke of the impure blood of the enemy, there was something racist here. But when Barnave speaks of the impure blood of the enemies of the revolution, it is obvious that there is no racial undertones here. The people who had been lynched, merchants, were French just like him, exactly of the same color and creed. And the only thing that Barnave hinted at when he said that their blood was impure was that they were not virtuous, they were not animated by the love of freedom, liberty, equality that characterized the revolution. So even then, if the word impure refers to the enemy, it is not along racial lines, but along political lines. And having a pure blood means embracing or being inhabited by virtues that are fundamental to human relationships. So now this is already something a bit different from our initial racial response to the line. But then note also that there is no reason to believe that everybody agreed with Barnave. Indeed, Barnave, who was not even a radical, was really a demagogue. And when he made this comment, I think he was trying to, appeal to the gallery and to the people present. And that actually terribly failed, for people started crying out from the audience, "Oh, le tigre! What a tiger!" Meaning by this that the words he had just uttered were those of a ferocious beast. And this nickname, le tigre, the tiger, stuck with Barnave for the rest of the revolution. So we see that even if Barnave's sentence can provide some grounds for the interpretation of La Marseillaise, it certainly cannot be taken as evidence of an overwhelming feeling at the time. So then the question becomes, now we have two plausible interpretations, and which was the dominant one? Can we even answer that question? We might wonder what was the meaning intended by the author of the song, but we have no clue about that. And then can we really wonder what each of the hundreds of thousands of people who sang the song had in mind when they sang it? Obviously, we have no reply to this, and that we have no answer to this question, and therefore we remain in doubt. But perhaps what really matters is precisely that these two meanings are possible, and that ever since the revolution, deciding which way you understand the lyrics of the Marseillaise has become an important political marker. And my interpretation, my favorite one, is certainly not only my own, it has an ancestry that can be traced way back, for instance, in the works of the French poet Arthur Rimbaud. I don't know if you ever heard of Arthur Rimbaud. As the picture suggests, he was very, very young when he wrote absolutely stunning poetry, which made him one of the most famous poets in the French history. He was very much the child prodigy. And he lived in times when, the revolution having failed, there had been Napoleon afterwards, and then some kings, and then another Napoleon, called disturbingly or confusingly Napoleon III, and Rimbaud lived in this period which was called the Second Empire. And the Second Empire was a time when France started expanding its colonial empire, and France justified its colonization by invoking the legacy of the revolution and of the revolutionary wars. The empire was trying to present France as an undomitable conquering country, and this infuriated Rimbaud, and he expressed his indignation in a gorgeous poem called Mort de 92, the Dead of 92. And in this gorgeous poem, he actually calls out to the people who died during the revolutionary wars and compares them to martyrs. He does this with extraordinarily beautiful metaphors. He describes them as pale with freedom's strong kiss, and he says that calmly, under their wooden shoes, they broke the yoke that waits upon the soul and forehead of all humankind. He describes them as ecstatic, and then this is the point that concerns us. He describes them as soldiers whom death has sown in all the old furrows to regenerate them. So here we see that clearly for Rimbaud, death had killed or had allowed the French revolutionaries to die so that they regenerate the furrows. And later on, he writes of their blood who washed all soiled grandeur. These are the yellowed parts on your screen. So you see that for Rimbaud, there is no doubt that the blood that was spilled in the furrows and that regenerated the land was that of the revolutionaries. And obviously when he's writing this poem, he has in mind the lyrics of La Marseillaise, which everybody knew at the time. And then the last line of the poem is really quite striking. Having ended his lyrical homage to the revolutionary, he concluded, "We let you sleep with the Republic. We bent under kings as under a rod, and Messieurs de Cassignac are talking about you again." I'm sorry that the last line's translation, I think, is hidden by the image of me talking to you. Now, Messieurs de Cassignac, this is a reference to some propagandists of the empire, people who were invoking the Revolutionary Wars as a justification to French imperialistic ventures. And this infuriates Rimbaud. So the last line reads like a bitter, heart-wrenching sarcasm. How do people like this dare invoke the memory of the martyrs of liberty? So already in Rimbaud, you see this dividing line appearing between those who make a nationalistic, imperialistic use of the legacy of the French Revolution and those who try to reclaim this legacy or perhaps to restore it to its initial impulse. And if we had the time, I could tell you how this relation to the revolution is an extraordinarily important cultural fact in French life. And we could even see how Aimé Césaire, the poet we mentioned before, the poet and writer who invented négritude, was himself a great scholar of the French Revolution and constantly tried, as he fought against French colonialism, to invoke the legacy of the French Revolution and weaponize it against the its nationalistic interpretations. So here you are. These are the kinds of issues that you would be introduced to if you studied modern and medieval languages at Cambridge. And you see that what is at stake here is a fine understanding of text embedded in history, but also with a sense of why text matters, meaning by this what it means to us today, and how poetry, for instance, can raise fundamental issues of history and politics as well. All right, so this is the end of this taster lecture. Just to conclude, a few lines about the way the course is structured. So roughly speaking, you would be studying two languages, and you would be studying them pretty much independently one from the other. And within each language, you have two fairly separate parts of the course as well, one dedicated to language and one dedicated to literature, history, philosophy, and so on. And here, Cambridge and I think Oxford have something quite specific, different from all other universities, which is that while the language part, of course, is done in language you are studying, the history, literature, political part is taught in English. And when you write your essays, you write them in English, although, of course, you quote the text that you study in the original. And I think this is a very, very good thing, because it means that from day one, from the get-go, we can do very sophisticated intellectual work, which would not be possible if you had to express yourself in the level of the language or in the target language at the level that presumably you will have when you arrive. So this means that you don't need to be perfectly fluent or bilingual when you arrive at all. You will have all the time you need to acquire the language, and meanwhile you will be able to engage in thorough and I think very interesting intellectual work. Now, and besides, as we have seen, although the two parts are separate, the skills you acquire in the one part helps you develop your skills in the other parts, so that 4 years down the line, and especially after the year abroad, which is the third year, in which will probably make you fluent in the language simply from being immersed in the target society. So 4 years down the line, you will become a fully rounded scholar of the culture, the history, the literature, and the language of the country of your interest. Okay, so I hope this little lecture has given you some interest in the course and perhaps a desire to join us, and in the hope of seeing one of you, two of you, or all of you sometime soon, I will leave you here and thank you for your attention. Thank you very much. Bye.